Hello, my name is Mary Arcee, and this is my section, assignment number 4. We will talk about three protest movements: the women's rights, the Hispanic American movement, and the African American movement. For each of these, we will talk about their goals, tactics, as well as the successes and failures of each of the following movements. Let's begin with the women's rights movement. Their goal was to end gender discrimination, have equality between men and women, gain reproductive rights, gain maternity leave, and to end objectification of women. This movement used tactics like the creation of organizations like the National Organization of Women, which was made to help women gain rights through the lobbying to make sure their political presence was there. Specifically in the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which at the time had many cases to deal with. As well, the women's protest movement tried for an equal rights amendment. As well, women used marches and organized publications as tactics for their successes. Another issue that this protest movement tackled were the rights of women over their own body, or reproductive rights. One of the biggest successes that can be credited to this movement is the Roe v. Wade court case. This case allowed women to legally have abortions before the third trimester in all states. But failures associated with this movement are the continuous battles that women face, such as unequal pay between genders, no paid maternity leave, as well as the uphill battle that continues for abortion rights in many states. The second protest movement to discuss is that of the Hispanic American movement, or the Chicano-Chicana movement. The goal for this movement was the end to racial discrimination, an end to unjust payment and exploitation of farm workers, and segregation, as well as securing the group's constitutional rights. The tactics employed by this movement were political, religious, and cultural. For example, in the political side of things came the emergence of LULAC, or the League of United Latin American Citizens, and the American GI Forum. These pushed for the fact that Mexican Americans were in fact white and U.S. citizens. Therefore, they should acquire the same rights and should not be discriminated against. As well, Cesar Chavez and activists used protests and marches to aid in the rights of migrant farm workers, where more often than not these farmers were being exploited and mistreated, living in conditions that were not apt for human beings. This group began La Causa, which used strikes in order to make their presence known to specifically the grape vineyards. This Chicano movement also used lawsuits. These led to some of the successes for them, like in Hernandez versus Texas for the Equal Protection Act, as well as throughout these tactics, this group achieved education improvements for kids in schools. Some of the failures that could be given to this group could be the fact that people were still not considered by the people citizens, yet they employed the rights, and that misconception that if you are of a different skin color, you are not an American citizen, which continue to be sources of issue and controversy in the country today. The last protest movement to discuss is the African American movement. This movement's goal was similar to that of the Hispanic American or Chicano movement, in that it sought to end racial discrimination and segregation, secure constitutional rights, but as well sought for the right to vote. The movement used tactics such as political and legal ones in court cases like Plessy v. Ferguson and Brown v. the Board of Education. They also used flyers, signs, marches and protests, nonviolent sit-ins to gain the attention of the American public. The use of organized groups to push for legal actions also helped, like the efforts of the NAACP or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, among others. Failures amongst this group were the use of militant black groups that sought to work against the government, as well as the rise of the Black Power movement led by Malcolm X. Successes that can be attributed to this group are the ruling that segregation was in fact unconstitutional as pre-dictated by the Brown v. Board of Education, the Voting Rights of 1965, the Civil Rights Act, as well as the push for affirmative action. Of all these three movements, I think that the African American movement possessed the most success out of all of them because they were able to successfully gather themselves as one to fight for their rights, and they had qualitatively the most success because we now reap the benefits of what they did, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and they were able to use what they had and their resources to create successful and meaningful protests to make the American people understand what they were fighting for and be successful.